Today on The Place for History, we're talking about Marlin Perkins. And you have a lot of resources there at the State Historical Society of Missouri up in St. Louis because he spent a number of years there, but he was actually born in Southwest Missouri. Can you tell me about his early life?
Yeah, absolutely. Marlin Perkins was born in Carthage, Missouri. His father was an attorney and later a judge. And he grew up in that area, had a fascination for wildlife, and interestingly enough, he up until the age of 7, he it was raised by his mom and dad. But after that, he ended up moving to Pittsburgh, Kansas, to live with his aunt. His mom, so Marlin contracted pneumonia, and
Mm.
during that recovery period, his mom was taking care of him, and because his mom ended up contracting pneumonia also and ultimately died from it. So really distraught. Marlin Perkins' dad got sent Marlin away to live with his aunt in Pittsburgh, Kansas. Worked on a farm. He had two older brothers. They ended up going to boarding school. So he didn't really grow up with his parents for the majority of his developing life. But yeah, worked on the farm in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and by the time high school came around, he went to Wentworth Military Academy in Lexington. And after during that time, his love for wildlife had continued to sort of flourish and grow. And he actually, there's a story that he would keep snakes in his dorm room while at Wentworth, secretly, obviously, and he every now and then he would let them sort of wander around in the yard at Wentworth. And one day he got caught by one of the professors and was told to get rid of him in a field nearby. But yeah, he's always had a fascination for wildlife, snakes especially. And I think he got that from his father because his dad was also a wildlife lover and particularly loves snakes. So so went to high school at Wentworth, and eventually after that went to Mizzou, studied at the College of Agriculture there. But he was always into wildlife.
As Indiana Jones might say, the fictional character, snakes, why does it always have to be snakes? So why
Right.
snakes?
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. It's got to be snakes, but yeah. So he was at the College of Agriculture at Mizzou for 2 years. After his sophomore year, he didn't like it very much. Talked to his dad. He's like, "Dad, what do I do? I don't like the College of Agriculture. I want to do something in wildlife." So he got his dad to okay his dropping out of college. So from that point, he moves to St. Louis and starts working as a sweeper at the St. Louis Zoo, lowest man on the totem pole at the St. Louis Zoo. So,
So he starts out at the very, very bottom.
yep,
He's
making a wage that he could barely live off of, just sweeping up, you know, pens, animal excrement, that sort of thing. Yeah, started at the very bottom.
How does he move up from the bottom? What's his first big promotion or small promotion?
So yeah, he got a couple small promotions over the next couple years. He also started in his personal time collecting reptiles and snakes, and he amassed quite a collection of reptiles and snakes. And this is in 1926 when he went to St. Louis. A year later, the St. Louis Zoo had developed the first reptile house, the reptile house that's there today.
Hmm.
Uh, and so Marlin Perkins was working there. He decided in 1928 to donate his large collection of reptiles to the St. Louis Zoo. And from that point on, the St. Louis Zoo decided to make him the curator of reptiles. So he went from this low guy to automatic, up to all the way to curator of reptiles, and he did that for 10 years. While there, he was the curator for reptiles. Um, so from that point, he leaves St. Louis, gets a job as a curator at Buffalo Zoo. Nothing really spectacular happens at Buffalo Zoo, but he does help establish it into a modern zoo. Helps make it nice and welcoming for people, and did that for a little while. And I think it was 1944, um, he accepts a job offer as the director of the Lincoln Park Zoo in
That
Chicago.
that is a big move there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Lincoln Park Zoo, I think it's like the one of the oldest zoos in the nation. It's either first or second oldest zoo in the nation. And yeah, big move for him. He directed from 1944 up until 1962, something like that. Um, but it's at the Lincoln Park Zoo that Marlin Perkins's film career sort of ignites. He From 1945 to about 1950, he started bringing the zoo animals onto the local television network, and showing them off, teaching people about the animals, doing that sort of thing. And um, in I want to say, yeah, 1950, he gets a call from from a potential sponsor for a a show, an actual show to that dedicate towards wildlife and showing off wildlife. And I believe it was the Mutual of Omaha. And we'll get into more of that later. But yeah, he had this show from 1950 to 1957. And this is a time when nationwide broadcasting was just starting to, it was the advent of nationwide broadcasting. I think in 1951 was the first coast to coast broadcast, and that was Truman that did his speech
Hmm.
to millions and millions of TVs across the nation. So Marlin Perkins gets in right at the advent of national broadcasting for his show. It's called Zoo Parade, and it takes the majority of the show takes place at the Lincoln Park Zoo, and it's him basically expanding on his forays into local broadcasting, bringing animals onto local broadcasting shows. So he did that for 7 years and started to gain national and some international prestige from it. So yeah, he after Zoo Parade ended in 1957, he stayed at Lincoln Park Zoo for a little while. But in 1959, this is kind of, I'm going to go off on a tangent here because I got to
Okay.
develop a little bit of backstory into
Sure.
the next part of Marlin Perkins's life.
Yeah. How
Um,
does he make that leap from the local TV to the huge national scene?
yes, I mean it was just kind of a thing of right time, right place, sort of. In Chicago, yeah, I mean, obviously Chicago is at that time is huge, huge city. There were national broadcasting, stations in Chicago. So they were able to sort of push out that broadcast everywhere. Um, but and he developed sort of a moderate fame from it. And it wasn't until a little bit later that he became very much more well known. But we'll get into that. So yeah, it was sort of a right place, right time. He was contacted by Mutual of Omaha, which sponsored and put money into his endeavor. And um, yeah, so by the time 1960 came around, we'll go into a little bit of backstory. In 1959, Sir Edmund Hillary comes to America, and Sir Edmund Hillary it was the first person to climb Mount Everest. So he's this big famous guy, and he gets a grant to come to America to give his talk about climbing Mount Everest. During this talk, he there was someone in the crowd that really got into his speech, and so he started talking with Sir Edmund Hillary, and Edmund Hillary brings up this thing that he wants to do. It's an expedition. He's convinced that climbing Mount Everest is possible without oxygen, and yeah. So this person that he speaks to, I think it was a one of an owner of World Books at the time, World Books of America or something like that. And they were headquartered in Chicago. So this guy from World Books enjoys Edmund Hillary's speech. He invites Edmund Hillary over to Chicago to their headquarters, starts talking with Edmund Hillary about funding an expedition to, see if we can climb Mount Everest without oxygen. And at this point, Edmund Hillary's like, I have another idea too that we can do alongside this other expedition.
Yeah.
He says, I want to find the Yeti. I want to go find the Yeti. I want to prove or disprove that there's a Yeti out there in the Himalayas. And the World Books guy was like, yeah, let's do it. So right there, Sir Edmund Hillary gets a grant for $125,000 to do this expedition. And being in Chicago, this guy knows a lot about Marlin Perkins. And the guy's like, you're going to need a zoologist to go with you to prove or disprove this Yeti if and when you find it. So I got the guy just for you. So he gets Marlin Perkins to do this expedition with Sir Edmund Hillary. So they go to the Himalayas, and the expedition lasted from September 1960 to June 1961. Marlin Perkins wasn't there the whole time. He was there for a couple months, from September to December. But they've got, they brought back film and pictures of the expedition. Marlin took extensive notes that we have here in the archive of his expedition. They brought back what they thought to be was Yeti evidence. They brought back, I'm trying to think of, they brought back supposed Yeti scalps, photographs. They brought back non-Yeti stuff like bear skin, goat skin. They were able to capture 2 red pandas and a fox that was native to the Himalayas. I suppose that was for the zoo, like that. Interestingly enough, they also came back with a severed, dried human hand, which I'm guessing they thought at the time it might have been a Yeti hand, but
Okay.
yeah. So yeah, they brought all that back to America, to have it, and to Europe to have it tested. Turns out that none of that stuff was Yeti. It was there were either bear scalps or whatever. So yeah, I mean, this expedition sort of helped Marlin Perkins become more internationally recognized.
So he gains fame from that expedition, even though they didn't find the Yeti.
Right. The whole expedition, yeah. I mean, it disproved the Yeti from that point, but it was still the main goal, the get to Mount Everest, get to the top of Mount Everest without oxygen. That ended up being, that ended up being good. They proved that they had to spend several months acclimatizing to that elevation. So
Mhm.
I think they stayed at 19,000 feet for um, 3 or 4 months before they made the final push to the peak without oxygen. But they did it. So yeah, after in 1961, after Marlin Perkins gets back, he continues to the work at the Saint or the Lincoln Park Zoo for another couple years. And in 1962, he moves back to St. Louis and becomes the director of the St. Louis Zoo
How
there.
does that happen? How do you go from, Chicago is a bigger city
Hmm.
than St. Louis. How does St. Louis and the zoo lure him back to where he started as a sweeper?
I think it was just sort of nostalgia and wanting to be closer to family. I mean, that was where he started. That's where all of his reptiles were. So yeah, I think it was just like a place that he always figured he'd go back to. Um, and in directing the St. Louis Zoo um, is a big thing for him, despite Lincoln Park Zoo being a bigger, better zoo.
Hmm.
Thanks to the help of Marlin Perkins, St. Louis Zoo eventually becomes one of the greatest zoos in the world. So, but yeah, he and his family moved back to St. Louis. He starts directing the St. Louis Zoo, and in 1962, in 1963, he 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 starts wanting to do another show like Zoo Parade, another show that um, educates people on wildlife and conservation and stuff like that. So he gets with the people from Mutual of Omaha again, and they agree to do another show with him. And the next year, they start Wild Kingdom. And Wild Kingdom, for people my generation, I'm 32. I didn't grow up watching Wild Kingdom, but my parents did. And when I told my parents that we had the Marlin Perkins collection here and I had reprocessed it and gone through everything and the Marlin Perkins stuff, he got all giddy and happy. He's like, I watched Marlin Perkins as a kid, on TV.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I remember the broadcasts.
yeah. It aired on NBC from like 1963, 64, all the way up to 1988. And Marlon Perkins was the host for the majority of that time. Um, when I'm giving tours of the archive here, it's mostly to students, right? And they're younger than me.
Hmm.
So when I start talking about Marlon Perkins, they're like, what, what? He was the director of the St. Louis Zoo. That's cool, but whatever. Um, and then I asked him, "Do you know who Steve Irwin is?" And they're like, "Yeah, Steve Irwin, crocodile hunter. He's awesome." I'm like, Marlon Perkins was the Steve Irwin of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like he was big back then. Yeah, Wild Kingdom was it wasn't the first of its kind, but it really opened the door to people loving and enjoying wildlife documentaries. And so, yeah, Marlon Perkins is huge. He would travel around the world filming wildlife and educating people on wildlife, and used his platform to promote conservation and help help protect endangered species, and this is the first time that really people are being widely introduced to this concept of wildlife conservation. um,
It comes with some perils, though. A lot of people say they remember, although I don't know that that's true, him being bitten by snakes.
Yeah, so I heard that. I also read that he was bitten several times by venomous snakes. He lived through all of them, obviously. But there was one famous instance where he was bitten by a snake. People remember, like you said, people remember him being bitten by a snake on the show. Um, and suffering through the venom, the poison, and stuff like that. But I read that he was actually bitten pre-show, but went on to film the film the episode, the show, while he was suffering from the venom that he got bitten by. So people are seeing that in from him. So yeah, I think that's where that came from. Yeah, several times he's gotten bitten by venomous snakes, and his at one point he got bitten by a gaboon viper and spent several weeks in the hospital
Ooh,
recuperating. Yeah.
ooh.
Um, but yeah, people loved Wild Kingdom, just like people love Steve Irwin and Crocodile Hunter. I mean, people are drawn to wildlife and wildlife conservation and learning about wildlife like that. But so yeah, Wild Kingdom aired until 1988. But Marlin Perkins, he retired from the St. Louis Zoo in 1970, in 1971, 1970, 1970 to 1971. And around that time, after he retired, Washington University gave Marlin and his wife Carol Perkins, who's also a big conservator, about 10 acres near Eureka, Missouri, to develop a wildlife center. And Marlin and Carol Perkins, being huge conservationists, wanted to build a wolf center where they could rehabilitate endangered wolves. So yeah, they started and developed the Endangered Wolf Center in Eureka. It's the only wolf center that is accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Um, and it's really cool. If you're ever in Eureka, Missouri, I highly recommend going to the Endangered Wolf Center, especially at night. At night is really cool during full moon, during the full moon time. They have wolf howls, and you can go there and howl at the moon with the wolves. It's pretty neat experience. So
I'm familiar with that. I did not know that Marlon Perkins and his wife established that.
Yeah, they established it, and when Marlon Perkins died, Carol actually continued to serve on the board there, and she basically took up his mantle of um, getting funds to service the wolf center and rehabilitate these wolves. They mostly rehabilitated red and gray wolves, and they've released them back into the wild. Unfortunately, we still have a problem with poaching, so it hasn't been as effective, but they're slowly gaining population in their natural areas. But yeah, Marlon and Carol Perkins, his daughter, Marguerite Perkins Garrick, she is on the board of trustees at the Endangered Wolf Center as well. And she's continuing to carry on the mantle of her parents. Yeah.
If somebody besides a student wants to come to your facility there in St. Louis, is there a display of Marlon Perkins memorabilia?
So yeah, we did have a whole exhibit right outside of our office of Marlin Perkins. The library that we're in on the University of Missouri St. Louis campus is under construction right now, so that's down currently. But we still have all of Marlin Perkins's stuff in boxes and in our stacks. It's freely accessible to anyone, and I often, well, every time I give a tour, I go to the Marlin Perkins stuff and I pull out, some of the artifacts from the Yeti expedition and kind of explain who Marlin Perkins is. He's one of my favorite historical Missourians. I can't not talk about him, especially the Yeti expedition. It's so fun and cool. And an interesting thing that we have here that they brought back was supposed Yeti hair. We've got it in a container in our one of
Okay.
our boxes, and we show it off, and people seem to love it. So yeah, freely accessible. So anyone can come by and take a look at that stuff if it's, for research or just for personal reasons that, they want to check it out, they can stop by.
So his impact goes beyond the St. Louis Zoo and Eureka. It really goes worldwide. Does his influence live on?
Absolutely. I mean, it lives on with, rehabilitating endangered wolves. In fact, I think NBC or whoever started Wild Kingdom back up with new hosts and new, educating people on wildlife and stuff like that. But yeah, his legacy, still continues, and we can see it in, the conservation efforts that he has, done over his lifetime.
Zach, I greatly appreciate you sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I love talking about Marlin Perkins. He's one of my favorite characters. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Paul.